In the contemporary debate about God and religion and so on, issues to do with science and religion are very much to the fore, particularly in the writings of the so-called New Atheist movement. And in this chapter, I try and get some conceptual clarity on issues like, well, what is science? What is theology? How do science and theology relate to one another? Are they talking about completely different subjects such that they never have anything of common interest to talk about? Or are there, as I argue in this chapter, sometimes areas of common interest, mutual interest, between science and theology, and trying to clear away some of the misconceptions about that relationship that tend to predominate in contemporary discussion. The relationship between science and theology is a very important subject because science is such a powerful social force in the world today. Science has such a prestige that people who speak with the authority of a scientist are often taken as being able to speak on metaphysical, philosophical matters with an authority that they really don't have as scientists. When scientists who are not trained in philosophy speak on philosophical matters, they are intelligent lay people on the subject, rather than people whose word should be taken as scripture on the subject, as it were. And yet, particularly amongst popular defences of atheism, many of these come from scientists of one stripe or another who are actually talking about philosophical issues and often being very demeaning towards philosophy as a subject in the name of science. And I think that is actually a profoundly anti-scientific attitude to take as well, when you notice that science itself depends upon a number of philosophical assumptions in order to work as a project, and that if you demean philosophy, you inevitably end up undermining and demeaning science itself. The question, what is science, is hotly debated among philosophers of science. This is a really tricky issue, actually, and I argue in the chapter that it's much easier to say what science is not than what it is, but I do venture forth with a definition and say something along the lines of science is about trying to find out the truth about the material world. Methodological naturalism is a rule that sometimes people try and build into the definition of what science is, and particularly when it's put in a very strong form, I think it's a very bad rule. In its strong form, methodological naturalism would be the idea that any scientific explanation must be consistent with the truth of metaphysical naturalism as a worldview. So methodological naturalism doesn't say naturalism is true, there isn't a God, and so on, but it says that science must behave as if there wasn't a God and as if naturalism were true. And I think that's a bad rule because it basically derails science as an inherently truth-seeking project. Because if it were true that there's a God and that he had done anything within the world that meant that there was no naturalistic explanation for something, or that a miracle really had happened and that was the true explanation for something, science would be forever precluded from finding the truth and would always be relegated to having to accept the best explanation that's consistent with materialism or naturalism. And that is not at all the same thing as accepting the best explanation or the true explanation. Theology is the subject that tries to bring everything that we think we know into a consistent relationship with our beliefs about God. So it's really the queen of the sciences, as the medievals used to say, in terms of it's the subject that tries to bring everything we think we know about everything, including God and his revelation to us, both natural and special, into a coherent worldview picture. Given those differing understandings of science and theology, you've got to sort out your understandings of the two before you can ask, well, are they consistent or inconsistent with each other? And certainly on the understandings of those disciplines that I argue for, they are consistent with one another. If science is the search for a true understanding of the material universe, and theology is the subject that's trying to get a true, consistent understanding of all of reality, it is of course consistent to say that the scientific understanding of material reality is a subset of our understanding of all of reality, that all including supernatural realities as well as natural realities. I don't think that science and theology as subject areas are in conflict with one another. There are certainly conflicts between particular scientists and particular theologians, if you like, or particular scientific theories and particular theological interpretations or theories. But when a scientific theory and a theological interpretation or theory are in conflict with one another, that leaves open a whole bunch of questions, such as, are they really or only apparently in conflict with one another? If they really are in conflict with one another, is that because the scientific understanding is wrong, or because the theological understanding is wrong, or because both of them are wrong? Those are all possibilities that one would have to work through. You can't simply assume that science knows the truth about things, and that if it ever really contradicts some theological theory, then it must be that the theological theory is wrong. I think what you have to do is you have to balance up the probabilities in terms of is this scientific theory really well supported? Is this a good interpretation of the facts of reality? Is this theological theory really well supported? Is it a really good interpretation of what Scripture is telling us? It might be that you have more reasons for believing the theological understanding than the scientific understanding. And if that's the case, then it would be perfectly reasonable for the theological argument to outweigh the scientific one. So there's a number of open questions that happen even in an apparent case of conflict between science and theology. One common area of interest between science and theology is over the issue of origins. Where do we come from? What explains our existence, and so on. Science and theology both have an overlapping interest in those kind of questions. And to work out what you think about those kind of issues, in the latter part of the chapter here, I suggest some questions that we need to go through. The primary one being, is the doctrine of creation, is the idea that we were created. However the Creator went about doing the creation, just the question, are we created or not? Because that is a fundamental issue, and the question of, well, how did the Creator go about implementing that decision to create is a secondary question which we can deal with down the line, but we're in a much better position to deal with if we already know whether or not we're here on purpose, whether we were created or not. So that's the foundational one. You can then get into questions about, what is the best interpretation of reality scientifically speaking, the best interpretation of what Scripture says theologically speaking, and how do we fit those understandings together into the best understanding of our origins.